Namaskar, Swagatam. Welcome to Center for Soft Powers Namaste 2020, a global Utsava of soft power. The session now is Nataka. I would like to welcome Sri Prakash Belwadi and Dr. GB Harisha, who is the director of Swami Vivekananda Cultural Center in Vietnam. Dr. Harisha is the director of the Hanoi Center. He has translated Veer Savarkar's book on Hindutva into Kannada. He is also an author of Hindu philosophy, and he has authored over 75 books and presented many papers. Sir, welcome to you, and we request you to address us today. Pranav, sir, not come? Hello?
I'll just speak to Koti Akka 1 minute.
Yeah. Then I will introduce Prakash also meanwhile. Yeah. We have with us Sri Prakash Belwadi. He is an Indian actor, a director, a journalist, a writer, and also somebody who is very passionate about the environment. He is the managing trustee and founder of Center for Film and Drama, which produces stage plays, conducts courses in filmmaking and acting. There is so much I can say about Prakash, but I think I will have to confine myself.
We have Prakash Belwadi ji, who doesn't need any introduction. We've recently seen him in the movie Shakuntala, where he did a brilliant role as the father of the young Shakuntala. But today's session is not about films, it's about theatre. In the morning, we had session on Ramayana, where we had dance rendition, we had musical renditions, where we painted Rama through just listening his name. And today in this session, we go a step ahead and see how Ramayana can be depicted through theatre. This is something which is also very common in a lot of Southeast Asian countries, where you have Thailand, their national literature and their theatre is an adaptation of Ramayana. In Indonesia, this is very common, and which is why our session today in the morning was named Colors of Sri Ram. And this is just a continuation to it. Maybe, Prakashji can delve a little bit into this more on how Ramayana is depicted through different forms, different styles in India, across India, and also in different countries. Yeah. Meanwhile, till Ambassador joins us, I think we can start the session now, and Ambassador can have his, Ambassador can share his thoughts later. Okay, so we'll wait for the Ambassador then. Prakash, I'd like to ask you that how long has your journey been with Ramayan theatre? Was it something that you conceptualized long back, or is it something much recent as a discovery?
I'm from a theatre family in the sense that my parents actually met, when they were young in the Green Room. In fact, the house I grew up in was called Green Room. And I've been exposed to theatre. I'm not an academic person. I'm not a scholar. I'm certainly not an intellectual. All the understanding I have comes from practicing theatre and writing for film and theatre, and sometimes directing and acting. So the idea of Ramayana as a place of or a narrative of conflicts was something that occurred to me very late in life, because I came from a natural left background, and I only saw the Ramayana as part mythology and part poetry. That's it. And I began to see the great dramatic elements in it only much later in life, I regret to say. And over the last 20-25 years, I've been fascinated with the different depictions of Ramayana that happen in Karnataka alone. So So what I'm going to do now will be something related to how I see these conflicts and how much value they give to any discourse on theater is what I would like to touch upon today.
Wonderful, wonderful. I think Akka has something to add.
Yeah, I'll ask. How does it feel, Prakash ji? You were talking about once when we were speaking about how Indian films are revisiting history now with a new lens. So is this? Do you see this as a trend even in cinema? Or us taking from our scriptures and looking at them with a contemporary lens?
You know, it's a good question to ask, but let me answer it in a strange way. You know, before we see what are the sources of confidence, you know, of Swabhimana, what are the sources we have for Swabhimana? I'm saying Bharat as a whole should be also seen in the context of what is it that made us lose our self-confidence. I think it's a very important question. Just this morning on Facebook, I was telling a very close friend, Anand Ranganathan had been, Twitter had blocked him for 10 days for some quote because of a quotation he had used from a religious book. And then they restored it with an apology. That's a very strange thing. You know, Twitter restored his account saying, you know, we apologize for the inconvenience. It appears we have made an error of judgment, you know. I find that fascinating. I'll tell you why, what I said in that context. You know, when we were young and following cricket very closely, and those days we had only 5-day, 6-day test matches, 6 days because we used to get a rest day sometimes in between. We could see that when India played cricket around the world, Indians did not know how to come back when it came to sledging. They didn't know how to retort. And you could see that in many countries, umpiring decisions were made with clear bias. But you know, Indian players didn't have the confidence to challenge it that much. And the instances they did challenge it have become like legend today. There was one incident when Chandrasekhar, the bowler spinner, used to bowl very fast googlies. He had clean bowled a player in New Zealand, and he turned to the umpire and said, "How's that?" And the umpire said, "You can see he's bowled." And Avilu Chandrasekhar said, "I know he's bowled, but is he out?" Okay, so that kind of thing became legend because Indians just did not know how to combat this. But you see, in the last 20 years, Indians give as good lip as they get, and sometimes even more. Sometimes they're like a nuisance. And that is something that's happened in the last 20 years or so. And to me, that Twitter will make that apology suggests a similar kind of civilizational correction. So I'm saying when we look at narratives that we want to depict, it has become very necessary for us to write our own history, to tell our own story. For centuries, our story has been told by others. Even in our textbooks, we see writers from everywhere in the world who tell the stories about Indians. It's as though we are under a doctor's microscope, or in this case, an anthropologist's microscope, and we're forever measured and commented on, and that we take as authentic text. You know, we would rather trust Monier Williams than Kalidasa kind of thing. I mean, no offense to anybody who loves Sanskrit or anything Bharatiya. It's just that we should be able to tell our own stories. If I call myself by a name, I'd rather you accept the name I use for myself and not label me with what you think is my name. You know, so broadly, that is my position.
Om Tat Sat. Kujantam Rama Rameti Madhuram Madhuraksharam Aruhya Kavita Shakham Vande Valmiki Kokilam. So, good afternoon to one and all. My apologies for joining the session late. respected Sri Prakash Belwadi ji, and respected Vijay Lakshmi ji, and all the dignitaries who are attending this event. First of all, I would extend my warmest welcomes to heartiest congratulations to the Center for Soft Power. So they are doing an excellent work by trying to build a narrative around the Indian culture with a new perspective and with a lot of originality. And on this occasion, I was requested by the organizers to speak on the Ramayana in a general perspective, as we know that the very famous theater artist and film artist and also a thinker of our our country, Sri Prakash Belwadi ji, is our own man. He is from Bangalore. So he is going to give a very elaborate session, a workshop on the said topic. Therefore, I will restrict my comments as initial remarks to only few things. Yeah, just I heard him a few sentences. I agree with Sri Prakash Belwadi ji. If I'm right, I consider or I will receive that insight as follows. It is like in our theater or in our poetic traditions, there is a concept of marga and also desi, that which is very the classical kind, and also which is adoptable, means which has the local or the indigenous ingredients of each landscape or each socio-cultural setting. Because one of our Kannada's foremost poet, Pampa, the author of Mahabharata in the Jaina version, he says, Margadol Puguvudu, Pokku, Desiyol Puguvudu. He says that you have to go through the marga, but you need not have to stop there. You need to take a deviation. So therefore, this margantara, or this deviation, is very characteristic of Indian literature itself. For example, if you see, to connect this statement with the Ramayana, for example, the Sita Parityaga part, that is sending Sita to the forest after the coronation of Rama at Ayodhya, that incident is given in a very picturesque manner by Valmiki in his Sanskrit Ramayana, which we considered as the Adikavya, the first and foremost poetry of Indian culture. Whereas, if you come to little bit later during the Gupta period, if you read Kalidasa's Raghuvamsha, in that also the incident of Sita Parityaga or leaving Sita to the forest will come. At that time, Kalidasa will make a comment saying that Valmiki Munireva Prachetasa Munireva Kathora Cheta. He says that I am not so stone-hearted as Maharshi Valmiki. Prachetasa is the name for Valmiki. That shows within the Sanskrit tradition, you can see there are different approaches to the same text. And if you take the Dhutakatodgaja of Bhasa's one of the famous play, in that the war will never take place between the Pandavas and the Kauravas. Means these kinds of things are found. So my question is why it is there? Why the local variations will come for the classical, or what we call as the Abhijata literature, namely the Ramayana and Mahabharata, and why that variation comes? The variation comes because ours is a continuity. Our tradition has a continuity. This is told by Kapila Vatsayana or Anand Kumar Swami or and Kirtinath Kurtkoti and many others, because for example, if you take Ramayana in Thailand, it is there as a theater, or it is there as a performance. That is very nice. But also, if you go to Indonesia, that is there as one art performance. But if you come to India, Ramayana is so differently narrated and so differently received, because it is an integral part of a living tradition. For example, today, if you go to Greek or the Italy, the Latin language, the Rome, you will find scholars on Homer or on Virgil, but that Homeric poetry, namely the Iliad and Odyssey, they no longer are a living tradition. Whereas in India, in Bharat, Ramayana is a living tradition. We celebrate Rama's festival, the birth of Rama, the victory of Rama, during the Diwali period, and also during our naming ceremony for the baby, for the kids, we take the names from our epics. So therefore, these epics are not our religious epics, as wrongly narrated by the Western Orientalists in the 19th and 20th centuries. These are our national epics, because, to use the word of Dr. Ramanohar Lohia, one of the very original thinkers from India, he says that Ramayana, Mahabharata, these are our two eyes of our culture. That the same has been told by many people later who follow him in one or the other way. So it means our language is, our cultural idiom always is through Ramayana and Mahabharata. For example, a person, for example, a woman who is very tender and also yet firm. So such character will always be associated with Sita. Or the devotion or the nishtha, what we say, it is always, that value is always associated with Hanuman. For example, in Karnataka, I am from Karnataka. I am from Hassan basically. I was residing in Bangalore. Now I am in Vietnam. For example, if one is eating too much food, that boy or a girl, they will, the parents in the home, they say that you're eating like Bakasura. Means that is a character from Mahabharata. So in India, it is not only there on stones or scriptures or sculptures, or only on occasionally it is sung or recited or remembered. It is re-remembered every day in our day-to-day affairs. This is the major difference between an Iliad or Odyssey or an Aeneid or a Beowulf or any such literature available in the Western world. And coming to this Southeast Asian culture is varied, but it is tied or it is bounded by Indic civilization. So the entire of the Southeast Asia, what we are calling as the old Indochina and the current countries of Vietnam or Indonesia, Java, Sumatra, then Thailand, up to Japan, including sometimes the China, these have the influence of the Indic tradition. So namely, it went through two directions or two streams from the same source of the Indian culture. One is through the Brahminical tradition, or what you call as the Vedic tradition, and another is the Buddhism or the Buddhist tradition. These two are our contributions to the Southeast Asian culture. But we need to remember that we are never aggressive in our approach. We are always artistic in our approach, always darshanika or philosophical in our approach. So though we went as their friends, we went as their elder senior friends in that way. And we try to accommodate their culture, their belief system, their art with our texts. But the stories and the narration varied from area to area. So the kind of Ramayana you find in Thailand, for example, it has the influence not only from Valmiki, but also from the local traditions and also from the Jataka tales of Buddhism. Again, these categories like Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, or Vaishnavism, Shaivism, Lingaitism, Sikhism, these are all the categories created by the West for its own different historical reasons. So that has to be totally challenged in an academic manner, in a very systematic manner, and the process has already been started. Many people from the last 10-15 years, they have started this process of systematically understanding the Orientalism, the attitudes of Orientalism, and the process to decolonize and de-Orientalize. In that, one point I want to add to this very important webinar on this day is, we are a civilization. We are a nation state, no doubt. India is a nation state, no doubt, and it is. But it has its own sovereignty, its own national symbols, national flag, national anthem. Well, we respect it and we really celebrate it. There is no doubt about it. But beyond that, compared to other nation states, our speciality is that our asmita, our identity lies in our civilizational values. For example, when the constitution was adopted, the painting or the sketch done by the famous Nandalal Bose from Shantiniketan is incorporated into the original copy of the constitution. That is depicting the life of Rama. From the pictures from Ramayana are there. Pictures from Buddha's life is present in our constitution. What does this say is that we have a very long tradition. We have got a long heritage. We have got a long civilizational foothold. So that is our strength. So nourishing that will be an important aspect of the future days of cultural diplomacy. For example, very recently the Tirukkurul has been translated into the Thai language. Very recently, last year, if I'm right. And such efforts are going on. For example, the Ayodhya Research Foundation from Uttar Pradesh, state government of Uttar Pradesh, they have started to collect and collate Ramayana in related information in the form of encyclopedia. This is called Global Encyclopedia, Global Ramayana Encyclopedia Project. So in that, wherever the footprints of Ramayana or Rama, anything related to Ramayana in any form, in any variation is found, that is already the process, the work has been started. Since I'm a part of that as a representative to Vietnam, I know that first-hand information. This is a very welcoming thing. It is like going back to our own ancestral roots, of course, with a very scientific temperament. Scientific temperament, I'm using the word as used by the scientists, not in otherwise, as it is sometimes prevalent in Kannada or Karnataka's cultural atmosphere. I'm not using in that sense. So therefore, the civilizational value is found in Ramayana. So there are a lot of things which I can keep on elaborating, but since I'm requested to make the initial comments, I will stop only at one instance or two instances. When Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji, one of our former prime minister, he was talking to the prime minister of the Indonesia, and they asked them that Vajpayee ji asked them, you are a Muslim country by your state. How is that you love Ramayana so much? If there is an international competition about Ramayana in play or in dance, once Indonesia won the first prize. Then Atal Bihari Vajpayee asked. Then the reply came from the Indonesian side. They said, we might have changed our religion, but not our forefathers. Our forefathers means our ancestral property, that property in quote rests with Ramayana tradition, with the Mahabharata tradition. Therefore, this is found in Indonesia. The police belt has Hanuman, or their airways is called as the Garuda Airways. And in many of their currencies have the photo of Ganesha, sketch of Ganesha. This shows that they are not considering Indic civilization as religion. This is the point I wanted to make. They are considering Indian tradition as a civilizational value, as a culture. So due to our contemporary limited secularist tendencies have limited, means I don't have anything against secularism. What I'm telling, the way it has been incorporated into the dialogues and debates in India, it has made Hinduism look like very parochial, very narrow. And it has been interpreted as a religious term. It's not religious term. It's a cultural value. Whatever the religion caste you belong to, but Rama, he represents the cultural symbol of India. Therefore, Valmiki says, Ramo Vigrahavan Dharmaha. And last point, since I'm in Vietnam, it is my duty to link Ramayana to Vietnam. Vietnam has a very long connection with the Indian tradition, Indian civilization. The Vedic tradition brought the cult of Shiva, or the worship of Shiva and Vishnu and Shakti to Vietnam. You can find it in the central Vietnam and southern Vietnam, and which is near to the Da Nang city and to the Ho Chi Minh city areas. And the Champa kingdom, they ruled for 1,300 years, and the Indian culture spread over the central and southern Vietnam. And in the Da Nang Museum, Da Nang is the name of a city in central Vietnam, there is a Champa sculpture museum. They call it as Cham Sculpture Museum. There, if you enter the museum, there is a big Shivalinga, which is excavated long back by the French archaeologists. And below in the pedestal, you can see the story of Ramayana. It's so beautiful. Means the Shivalinga and the pedestal has the depiction of Ramayana story, namely the marriage of Sita, the Sita Swayamvara with Rama, and the monkeys, Vanara Sainya, the monkeys army, helping Rama to win over Ravana. So these stories are depicted in stone in the Champa art or the Cham art, which is a national heritage of cultural heritage of Vietnam. And finally, they say in the museum, there is one sculpture. It is a little bit, it is broken. In that, Sita, they say Sita in Ashokavana. So Sita is found in Ashokavana in that sculpture. So such things are there. So it means we have forgotten a lot. So our amnesia, our cultural amnesia is so deep. So I'm very happy that today we have the honor to listen to Prakash ji. And also I congratulate Vijay Lakshmi ji for organizing such a series of Utsav. And I conclude my remarks by congratulating both the speaker of the day and the organizers for this wonderful session. Namaste.
Thank you so much, sir. Namaste. Without much ado, we will move over to Prakash ji. Thank you.
So thank you so much. Thank you for that scholarly presentation, Harish Aure. See, this is what actually I would like to start with, because if you hear our scholars speak about us, they apply logic and they apply argument that comes from an Indic imagination. When somebody else analyzes, and I don't mean non-Indian, I'm saying we are so colonized in the mind, many of us, that when we make an analysis of our own work, we apply Western templates or templates from people who don't really understand the culture as well. So I'll begin with this. I'll speak for maybe half an hour and then we can do a Q&A. I'll set the context briefly. Because I'm a theater practitioner, I approach the Ramayana not from the viewpoint of literature or even of poetry. Simply because the Ramayana is an Indian work and an Indian cultural narrative that precedes the division of knowledge. What do I mean by the division of knowledge? I mean, crudely speaking, this breaking up of knowledge between the humanities and the sciences is an artificial division because how can you make the division? How can any person live with only one? We should have a balance of both. And we should not even refer to them as both. It's knowledge. And also I want to say the Ramayana is also an Indian imagined idea that is before the division of mythos and logos. You know, which actually is in a way of echo of the division of humanities and sciences. Because what is real about the printed book, the concretization of sound depicted as word, printed on a text, printed as text on a piece of paper, or beamed on a screen as we can do now. How is that more real than the imagination? And how does one actually divide the imagination when it comes to anything abstract? What is the idea of law, for instance? It can get concretized only in the idea of punishment, or on the other side in the idea of compliance, for instance. So I'm saying the Ramayana does not come with a division of mythos and logos. You can be an atheist and see the Maryada Purusha in Rama. That is how it is. So I will start with some of the fascinating conflicting positions that we get in the Ramayana. The first one I want to say is that we apply, let us say, feminism as a construct to analyze the Ramayana. But actually the framework of feminism becomes a very limited context to get the conflict correctly or fully that the Ramayana would suggest. Let me give some examples. The first is an idea of Rama being sent to the forest because one of the wives of Dasharatha says, her son has to be made the king, and the prince, the eldest prince Rama, should not only be disinherited, but also be exiled to forest, because he's a very popular figure, and it should not lead to unrest that the most popular prince has not been made king. So when Rama is exiled to forest, what is a feminist construct you can apply to this? Look at the number of things that happen. This is a promise that Dasharatha has made to his wife many years ago in the past. It's an oral contract. He's just promised us something, but she uses that when it matters the most. How much does it matter to Dasharatha? This Putra Viyoga, the going of Rama, hurts him so much that he actually dies. So, who won in this story? That he kept contract with because he's given a word to his wife, is Dharma. Now let's see what happens later in the Ramayana. Rama absolves or redeems Ahalya. Now the thing is, Ahalya has been cursed because of, you can interpret it variously, but I will say that because she's suspected of infidelity of lusting after another male by her husband, the sage Gautama, and Rama redeems Ahalya. He's non-judgmental about this. Look at Rama himself, Ekapatni Vrata, for instance. Now we can mock at it, but the thing is, in the Ramayana, he does not do it because of religion. He does not do it because it's a princely dharma. His own father had more wives, which he had to suffer grievously later, right? So I'm saying, why does Rama value this oath he's given to the Vrat that he's made with Sita? It's because it's again an example of interpersonal contract that he makes. And he redeems this forever. So when you judge him for punishing Shurpanaka so brutally, he does it because she comes in deceit as Sita, and he could have done something so wrong. He would have committed something that he considers is so wrong that he could have broken contract that he had made with his wife Sita. So when we judge him, we have to judge for all the mistakes that he makes. You have to see it in the context of dharma or dharmic conflict. So that is what I mean by conflict. I also say this, that when you look at Rama as a character, he has no divine or miraculous intervention to absolve him from the problems he faces. In fact, it is Hanuman who has miraculous powers. He can swell to any size. He can lift a mountain and fly across, leap across the ocean or the channel, if you wish. It is Hanuman who can actually sit when he's in Ravana's court, when his tail is set on fire, and he can freely set fire to the entire town and come. It is Hanuman who has miraculous powers, that he gets punched in the face by the sun himself, means he could leap to that. Rama has no such powers. He needs the help of the monkeys actually to build a bridge to get to Lanka. One of the reasons why Rama is not given divine powers is to enhance this nature of conflict. And the nature of conflict, as we say in theater, even in Aristotelian terms as themes, is this: man is pitted against God, man is pitted against nature, man is pitted against the society he inhabits, man is pitted against another, and I say man or woman in this case, and man is torn in conflict on what to do when he has so many dharmic duties to deliver, and there is a challenge of resource all the time. What should he do? And what are the resources we have? Whatever we have limited money, we have limited weapons, we have limited support, we have limited strength, we have limited means, and the greatest limitation of all that mortals must encounter is time. We don't have time. We have to take risks in any dramatic narrative, stories told in time, whether it's a play or a musical rendition of a story, or a movement rendition of story, or a movie. It is constructed in time. Even we have the same word, play, for sports and for theater. Even in Indian languages, we say arta in Kannada for both. We do that because even there is role play. There is a construction of tragedy which is not tragedy. Sports supposed to delight you. It's when you become so foolish that you make such personal identification with the game, with the side that is playing the game, that you feel real sorrow. Otherwise, you're not supposed to feel sorrow. At the end of the play, we actually do visarjana. We dissolve the role in front of the audience. We come and grin to them. We bow to them and say, actually, I'm not Rama. I'm not Lakshmana. I was just playing these roles. And we do that because we know the difference between mythos and logos. And we know that logic is no more or less important than mythos. That the imagined world, the imagined pain, the aesthetic of feeling, of bhava. Bhava comes from being, bhava, to be, bhava, what you feel because you are. That, to imagine pain that is not your own as an aesthetic, is mythos. And how is that less important? Why is empathy less important than the law, for instance? We know this casually in the theater, and we know this casually as a culture, but we do not see it in the formal education, the marga that Harishji was talking about. See, the marga that Harishji is referring to should have been our marga, but the marga we have is a study of Indian literature, of Indian culture, of Indian Vedic texts by somebody who never visits India. Even Max Muller, he never came to India. He's a scholar. He's India's best known academic about India, about our Upanishads, about our Vedas, about the epics. Although he never came to India, which had lost its formal academic structures because of internecine wars and invasions and all that. We didn't have a formal education system left anymore. And then this man writes about something that survives only in the oral tradition. Never watched an Indian play, never watched never heard Indian music. There's a great incident in one of the memoirs of Tagore, where Dwarkanath Tagore, the grandfather of Rabindra, goes to Paris. Max Muller is 28 years old, and he says, I've never met an authentic Indian, so I would like to meet this man. And he visits Dwarkanath Tagore in an apartment in Paris. And he says, is there such a thing as Indian classical music? So Dwarkanath first plays to him a Western classical piece. And Max Muller says, that's very good that you know the piano so well. Is there something known as Indian classical music? So Dwarkanath Tagore actually plays something in Indian classical raga. And Max Muller, I'm paraphrasing, but he uses 3 words. He says, there is neither music nor melody nor meaning in this piece. And Dwarkanath Tagore tells him, you know how many years it took for me, how many years of practice, assimilation, and effort to understand it took me, so for me to be able to imbibe a Western classical piece, understand the harmonic scales, and actually render it in your presence on your instrument. And then it took you less than a minute to judge an entire culture. So that is what we have got. And that is how we're talking to each other. One of the reasons why I say this is that once I organized a seminar in a very famous theater in Bangalore called Rangashankara. I was the director of the festival, and I organized a panel discussion on the question of Desi and Marga. And a German scholar, I think her name was Dr. Hannah de Bruyn, I may be mispronouncing it. So she was there as one of the panelists. I'd called her. And she said this really dramatic thing. She said, this is a theater that can seat about 300 people. I've gone to seminars all over India with this kind of thing, or to talk about this kind of subject. She works, I don't know whether she still does it. At that time, she was working with Terakuttu in Kanchipuram, which is a neighboring state from where I live in Tamil Nadu. And Kanchi is an ancient city in India. And she was doing a Desi theater form there. She was practicing with local artists. And she said, I've been everywhere. And I see in seminars, which can seat 200 people, 300 people, you discuss as though you are Marga, that you are the formal classical tradition. And you treat that as Desi. And you talk in terms of mainstream and slipstream. Let me tell you, that is the mainstream, because that exists extant across invasions and occupations and changes of law and reigns and dynasties over thousands of years. In these villages, it's extant. There is a continuous tradition of doing the Ramayana and Mahabharata. In their own ways, they do it. Is that mainstream, something that has lived for thousands of years, in 500,000 villages and towns? Is that the mainstream? Or you, in your puny, she didn't use the word puny, but you in your small halls, are you the mainstream? That is the question. I say this because if you can actually apply the conflicts of Rama even to a modern political discourse, the kind of complexity of argument, the dharmic conflict that I'm talking about, that you need to do something before time runs out. Let me return to conflict of time runs out. I'll give a dramatic example of time runs out. The princess has been kidnapped. It's an offense to kingdom, not only to his male ego, that the king allows this to happen. I felt really hurt that the man who was my prime minister, who could have become prime minister again, is killed by somebody who comes from another country, a friendly country, an outside extreme element from a friendly country comes here and kills the man who could have been my prime minister. And we have nothing to do. We have no response. We have no action to take, except make an attempt to hunt down the person who came here to do it. And we did nothing to eliminate what caused it. Because, we are a pacifist country. We have a pacifist tradition. We're referring to the same 2 countries as in the Ramayana. Rama is similarly conflicted. But here he has to take revenge for a personal offense, which he sees as an offense to his culture and nation. And he needs to act. And remember, this is a time when the globe is not divided into nations, where nation was not a political word, but must have been a cultural word. There are cultures, the peoples of the world were divided as cultures culturally diverse. They were not divided as politically diverse. Politics was decided by kings who would get suzerainty or who could get vassals who would pay them taxes. That's all it meant. The people were not involved in this identity conflict of who rules whom. Wars were not done between peoples. They were done between armies, and armies were full of mercenaries, people who could be paid. So Rama has no army. He goes to a place and he needs to invade a place not because he's against the people, because he specifically and particularly is against a king. And what does that king do? He takes Sita by deceit. He takes her to his palace, and his wife confronts him. And she says, "Did you bring her with her consent?" He says, "No." And he makes the promise, "Do you know, I will not lay a finger on her until she consents." But he has taken away her freedom. He imprisons her. She's robbed of her free will. But in this particular context, he practices dharma. Who? Ravana, because he's scared of his wife. She's not judging him for bringing another woman. It's the morality of its time. She says, "Did you get a consent?" This is dharma we are talking about. And this is what we should have learned. This is how we should have spoken. But we don't do that. And what is the conflict Ram can have? This is a beautiful wife of his. She's been kidnapped by this powerful king who seems to be even more advanced civilizationally than where Rama is, of course, at that moment. And Ram must get her before she is physically taken by him, before she's sexually taken by Ravana, because then he will have further conflict about receiving her back. That becomes another story altogether. So time is running out for him. This is how stories in time are constructed. And the hero becomes an underdog. He doesn't have the resources, or she doesn't have the resources in this case. Whatever, they don't have the resources. They must act now and restore what they had as the norm before. And it's a struggle. So these are the conflicts. I'll tell you a very interesting story about Ravan that we do as a play in Karnataka. But our Desi traditions are dying out. It's a real pity. They're way more radical and powerful. Nothing that you see from modern left liberal or Marxist or feminist construction of our themes is equal to the stuff we get from our own theater. I'll give you one example. We have a Kannada almost folk traditional play called Prachanda Ravana. Prachanda in Sanskrit means tremendous, Ravana. The story is briefly this. Before he goes to war, because Ram as a Kshatriya comes from a Vedic tradition, because you have to shed blood on earth, you need to take the earth's permission before you shed blood. So he needs to do a yagna to take permission from the elements, from the 5 elements, because he's going to use them in violence, So he says, I'm doing it for dharma. I need the permission of the 5 elements. He says, I need to do a yagna, which is a fire ritual he has to do. But he's in a part of India at that moment, whatever was India then, it's a very modern notion, but Bharat, he's in a part of Bharat where he can't find a Brahmin or a person who can come and conduct the ceremony for him. So he says, how can I go to war without doing the yagna? So Vibhishan, who is actually defected for dharmic reasons from Ravana's camp to Rama's camp, who is Ravana's brother, Vibhishan says, why don't you ask my brother? My brother is a great scholar. He's a great Pandit. He's a Mahabrahmana. He's learned in the Vedas and all the rituals. Why don't you ask him to come and conduct the yagna? And Rama says, how can I do that? I'm going to war against him. And Vibhishana says, you're going to war against him as a king, but he's also a Brahmana. If you ask him to conduct a ritual for dharmic reasons, he cannot say no. It is his duty as a Vedic Brahmin to conduct the ritual for you. So Rama sends word to Ravana. Ravana, because he can fly down, unlike Rama who has to build a bridge, he flies down, conducts the yagna for Rama and Lakshmana as the Advaryu, or the person who can conduct the ritual. And Rama and Lakshmana fall at Ravana's feet, touch his feet to take his blessings. And Ravana says, Vijayi Bhava, because he has to say that. That means, may victory be yours. And he goes back. And then the war follows and he dies. How is that for conflicted duty? How is that for doing what is priority? And priority is context. It needs time. And even if it seems contradictory, that is what drama means to us, that there is a conflicted protagonist, he or she, and she has to make a decision that is going to displease many things. She'll violate one thing to make good another. And she has no time and she has limited resources, but she must act as best as she can. Isn't that how we live? That should have been the inspiration of this drama for us. And that is how we should have lived. And this is what we should have been taught in school. I learned this after I was 40 years of age, because I turned from my left Western education background. I began to look at our own work and I began to discover exquisite, highly nuanced, truly painful conflicts that Maryada Purushottama Rama has to face. Listen, let us take a Nobel Prize winner for literature today. They may be very good. Let's take some of the best screenwriters in India, maybe Javed Akhtar, or Salim Khan, or Vairamuttu, or in Kerala, Bashir, some of our best writers, let us take. Now the thing is, can we say that Valmiki, as a poet, writer, had less imagination than them? He could have given Rama magical powers, and Rama, by just meditating, could have got Ravana burnt because of spontaneous internal combustion. It doesn't happen. Why does he render Rama as an underdog? To apply the literary templates to bring your constructs of theories to this great work is a bad certification that you give to yourself. In the Upanishads, we have a great saying neti, neti. It means not that, not that. When you assert that this is God, or such is the universe, or this is my nation, as a part, you should become guarded and realize you're a part of the whole and say, not that, not that, because there is stuff that you may not know perhaps. This is more than humility. This is an understanding of another great Upanishad term, from the Chandogya Upanishad, Sarvam Kaluvidam Brahma. This is everything that is manifest belongs to the creation. And we are just a part of it. And to keep exploring ourselves internally, to perform a play where it is mythos, but you get logos from it. This is the aesthetic of rasa. That, the pain that happens on the stage, the feelings that are evoked by the actors, by the performers on stage, in the performance time, that you feel, they don't feel that because they've been rehearsing that and doing that for thousands of years. Or in a personal actor's case, maybe for a year or for a few months at least. They don't feel it. It is you sitting in the hall that feels it. That feeling is not your pain. It's not their pain either. They'll celebrate that day they produce tears in your eyes. You will celebrate that you watch such a production or performance. It's not our pain. It's an aesthetic of pain that we understand, which we call rasa. And that is a meeting of mythos with logos. To us, for Nataka, this is our Alankara Shastra. This is how we must understand our performance culture. I mean, I love Brecht's theory of alienation. I love Grotowski. I love, what Stanislavski says. I love in cinema what Eisenstein says about, thesis and antithesis. But I already have Vibhava and Anubhava. I have it already. I understand this better. And I have performances in 500,000 places in India practically every day where people understand it in their own way, where it is no offense to question Rama. One last conflict of Rama I'll give. When, Vali is a Rakshasa who is given a great gift. The gift is anybody who fights Vali will lose half of his strength to Vali during the fight. He loses it gradually. So the longer the fight happens, the less powerful you will become. This is the gift that Vali has got from an irresponsible power. This is how Indian stories are. Gods can be irresponsible. Actually, God does not mean what God means in English language. Let that be. But, power. So Rama cannot fight Vali from behind, from face to face, because he will lose half his power. So in our Yakshagana performances, there is a seasonal Yakshagana called Talamadale, where we don't have stage performances because 4 months of the year it rains in coastal Karnataka, which is the center of Yakshagana for us. But people are so addicted to it. They love this so much that just people meet in a temple or in a house and they do a performance, unrehearsed. Roles are not even allocated. They meet and say, you do this, you do this, you do this today. And people sit and watch. They may do it for 2 hours. They may do it for the whole night. And people, because they know the mythology so well, they have so much wit, they make up the dialogue. And somebody is assigned the role for the day, whoever is available to do that. And they do it. And the Vali Prasanga in Talamadale is so brilliant. No costume, no makeup, roles just assigned, impromptu dialogue. And one great thing about this is, it's just one moment. Rama has shot Vali from behind. And Vali is surprised that he's being shot. He turns and he sees Rama and he asks, how can you, a Maryada Purusha, a model of Dharma, a great hero, how can you sneak behind me and shoot me? He says, he's going to die in a moment. He asks this question and Rama tries to answer that question. And Vali engages him in argument. Whole night, they'll perform this. That moment is performed for the whole night. And this is the conflict. Why does Rama do that? In a Talamadale discussion, you'll get fantastic things. For instance, you'll get dramatic irony. See, Rama is supporting Sugriva. Vali's grouse with Sugriva, among the many grouses, is that Sugriva has taken his wife. Rama has a moral echo of this because Ravana has taken his wife at that moment. He needs the help of the army, of the monkey army. And Sugriva is king. He needs Sugriva's help. There's a practical angle to it. There's a personal, empathetic angle, a moral angle, and there is this practical angle. And Rama, as prince, cannot lose the battle because he'll bring a bad name to his kingdom or to his culture. He needs practical help too. So he swallows his pride, he gives up his heroic ego and does what is best for him, which is to kill Vali. And one of the questions Vali asks him is that, in the Talamadali thing, he asks is that, when your wife is taken, you're so upset. Sugriva has taken my wife, is that okay? So Rama tells him, see, when Sugriva took your wife, he thought you were dead. He thought she was a widow. And he thought she was to be rescued, or maybe he coveted her. But the thing is, he didn't know that you were alive. He took you for dead. And he took his wife. And he uses the word adu pramada. That means it is an error. I mean, I can't even translate it correctly. It is an error. Whereas what you're doing is that you want to forcibly take back his wife. And you know that she's married to him. That is actually aparadha. It's a crime, he says. Like this, nuanced, it carries on throughout the night or as long as the performance lasts. And all the best lines are given to Vali. It is subversive in nature. This is a very devout society, remember, where Yakshagana is performed. And it's so subversive that you could question the mythos of Rama, ultimately as even a figurehead of God. But he can be questioned. This is our culture. It is unmatched or very rarely matched in world traditions. And I will tell you what is the power of Yakshagana and finish. There are two temples in coastal Karnataka. One at a place called Katil and one at Mandarti. There are two temples. These are temples for the deity Durga Parameshwari. Now, one of the tradition, in our tradition, one of the things that you can do is you can do a yagna as a performance, because just like yagna can do loka kalyana, good for the world, a performance which creates aesthetic does the same power for everybody when they participate in this. So you can actually do an yagna as a performance. So the temple actually maintains a theatre troupe that performs prasangas, yakshagana prasangas, which always have moral lessons, ethical dilemmas, dharmic conflicts, and a conclusion of why pramana is what is there in the Ramayana and Mahabharata and the Upanishads and the Puranas. What is pramana? When you're so conflicted, when you don't know how to act, you take these as precedents, these great heroes have done, and you draw inspiration and comfort from it and act accordingly. This is pramana that you draw from the past. That is why the epics are so important to us. And they always have ethical, salutary effect on the audience. So when they perform, many people book a performance because they have taken, say, God, ask the deity, let my daughter pass this exam and get a medical seat. I will dedicate a performance, to that. So many people have made these vratas and they made promises to the deity. So they ask for a performance. Now, because there's so much demand for a performance, they said, let 10 people or 10 families come together and ask, we will do a performance for 10 people because we cannot meet so many performances. Now that got filled up. So each temple maintains 7 different troupes that can simultaneously do 7 performances. Okay? So that 70 families or entities can actually meet, offer a yagna. 70 families. Both temples maintain these 7 troupes. And now my question is this, and I'll close. If you want to book a performance, do you know when your turn will come? You have to wait for 25 years for your turn. It's that popular. When I was in school and college, in my general knowledge books, we were told about how Mousetrap is a long-running play in London. How's this? You'll never see it anywhere. Nobody will ever tell you, because these are living traditions. Indians don't write about their own tradition. They don't analyze it. They don't even look at it. There are some scholars like Harishji, who just spoke. But they're not actually looked upon as Indian intellectuals. The only certification you get as an Indian intellectual or an Indian critic or Rasika comes from the exams you passed answering questions about Western academic traditions, Western aesthetic traditions. And it is falsely applied. It's like me correcting somebody. All Indians correct each other's English. No, none of us speaks English like an Englishman could. No Indian child will make a mistake, or no child in the world will make a grammatical mistake in its own language when it's 3 years old. So let's think about this. I know this was to be a workshop. Unfortunately, we can't sit across each other and do improvisations exercises. That would have been a great workshop, but one day, hopefully in the future. Thank you very much for listening to me. I'll take questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Prakashji. It was truly enlightening to understand the conflicts and also have a theatrical perspective to it. Before we jump onto the questions, I know that we said it can't work for having improvisation, but any verse of Ramayana that you personally like and would you like to do an abhinay around it? It'll be great to see you perform it just a little bit also.
No, I know, but the thing is like, I'm basically not an actor, though I do a lot of acting now in cinema. I'm more like a writer, director, and I'm extremely shy about doing acting in a workshop, So please, I've already said this, please excuse me, I do that. But I can tell you what dramatic improvisation exercise we could have done. I'll give one example.
Sure.
When after Sita does the, Agni Pariksha, it's such humiliation. It's important for him because they will go back. When they go back, Rama will be crowned again as king, remember? Okay, after those 14 years, after this period of exile, when he goes back, he'll be crowned as king again. So the thing is, it is really important for him that people do not suspect Sita's pregnancy. It's a very important consideration. So he needs to do a physical demonstration that she's chaste. Okay? And a miracle happened that Sita is not burnt, during the Agni Pariksha. Okay? And that miracle is not done by Rama. It's a miracle of Sita's, actually, She survives it, and they go for the Pattabhisheka.
Right.
At the Pattabhisheka, Sita is given a diamond necklace. And it's a beautiful, exquisite necklace. She's given that, and she's asked to actually take the necklace to her favorite person. Okay? Sita takes that and turns towards Ram. And he bends his neck down because she's going to put the necklace on him. She walks past him and puts it on Hanuman. Okay? Now the thing is, I gave you a juxtaposition. No, I gave you this scene and I gave you that scene. And let's say we enact it. We can discuss this. I'll keep on giving motivation of what she remembers at that moment when it happens. She remembers that the first person she sees is Hanuman when she's imprisoned. He's more powerful than her husband, he who cannot fly over and rescue her. Okay? He gives her a token of confidence, Abhignana, the ring, with Rama's seal. Right? And the thing is, her gratitude towards him is a profound female gratitude. It's way bigger. See, because the great story that is told here is that Hanuman owes her nothing. Okay? So what she feels for him is friendship. To realize the value of friendship, which is a personal choice you make. Like the Swayamvara is also a personal choice. She makes and gets Rama. She makes a personal choice of favorite friend with Hanuman, right? To me, the Ramayana is full of such really delicate small things, It is fascinating. I'll tell you one more and I'll stop, okay? In Michael Madhusudan Dutt's Ramayana, see, Michael Madhusudan Dutt used the Ramayana to tell a story about our own people and other people, okay? He meant the British. He couldn't say it directly. So he actually pretended he was writing the Ramayana, but he was actually saying something else. What he says is, here in his story, Lakshman himself goes to the palace of Ravana in Lanka. It's not Hanuman. Lakshman himself goes there. And Lakshman enters the palace. He sneaks inside and he sees Indrajit, Ravana's son, doing Sandhya Vandana, which he's doing his daily prayer. And Lakshman looks to kill him. He sneaks a arrow out of his, and he puts it in his bow and he looks to shoot. But the hackles, rise, the hair at the back of his neck rise. Indrajit senses that somebody's aiming at him. He turns around and with whatever small vessel he has doing the puja, he throws it at Lakshman. It hits Lakshman's temple and he faints. So Indrajit comes and says, how could this happen? How can this man come so close to where I am inside the palace? Who let him in? I have security. And he finds out that Vibhishan has cheated and allowed Lakshman to come in. He says, uncle, how can you do this to your own brother? He says, because he is wrong. My brother is wrong. So Indrajit tells Vibhishan, if we have mistakes within us, if one of us has done something wrong, we should punish those people by our law. We will correct ourselves. Why do we now do an outsider to come here and make our law and teach us a lesson, he asks. Okay? It's an inspiration you draw from the Ramayana. Now we can do that story as an improvisation thing. So that is what I meant. We could have done many such exercises.
Absolutely, absolutely. We have a question here. Can the West really understand the Indian point of view if they want to? In other words, they're a bias conscious towards our works, towards our epics, towards our creative thought.
See, there is much to admire with the West. See, one of the things that you can really admire is that I have seen that generally the Christian communities around the world, they don't so readily take offense when you do blasphemy. Okay? If you do something, say something sacrilegious about their figures of divinity or faith, they don't as readily take to violence or they don't take offense. They seem to be more tolerant, to criticism or sarcasm or irony or even abuse. But that has come at great cost. It's come at the cost of colonialism, of missionary activity, forced conversions, wars, violence, brutality, the Spanish Inquisition, all that has happened. They burned Bruno at the stake for being scientific. They punished Galileo. But they seem to have done some reconciliation. So there's a great ethical stream as well in Western, Christian traditions, where they have this gift of introspection, of resolving ideas with logic and by compromise. I mean, you could see the Pope himself was doing it, the way he was so liberal, it seemed. Now, the thing is, we don't seem to get that with others. Not that much. I would say including many sects of Hindus. We can get Hindu itself is such a divided, inclusive and dividing word it is. We don't know what actually it means. It means different things to different people. There's no one single church or owner, one single book is not there. Now, what we can learn from this is that we can have dialogue. My point is we can do the dialogue not by Western terms. We can only do it by Indian terms. The idea of dialogue, Buddha's dialogues, or the dialogues, that they're as good as the dialogues of Plato in Republic. The Buddhist dialogues, they're fantastic. Those conversations. Tala Madhyale is a living tradition. The Yakshagana is a living tradition of wit, contemporary understanding of ideas, applying the values of the Ramayana, Mahabharata, the epics or the Puranas to modern day, ideas. We can do this all the time. My only request or submission is this: the West has a lot that it must apologize for. Okay, for brutalities it is practiced within, and it's practiced to it is done with colonialism. Okay. Even the greatest liberal traditions in Europe today, should not forget there was an immediate past. They had a First World War which ended in 1919. In 20 years, they had the best of literature, of philosophy, of music, of performance, of industry, and yet they went to war with each other. A brutal war which ended in 1919. In 20 years, they did identity politics and went to a war that is even more brutal in 20 years. So what was the meaning of all that they had learned? So I'm saying the West is much that it needs to be ashamed for. They're forever telling us that there is much that we should be ashamed for instance, the caste system or untouchability. But we have outlawed a lot of this stuff. Untouchability is outlawed in India. It's a crime. Taking dowry is a crime. Demanding dowry is a crime. Child marriage is a crime in India. Banishment of widows is a crime in India. Many of the traditions that were wrong, we have outlawed. We have written it into the constitution. It's a crime. We have not fully corrected ourselves maybe, but we will. But if you want to correct it, apply a dharmic idea of conflict. We have many things to attend to. We are a poor country with too many people claiming too little resources. We have to share air, water, land. It is very difficult for us. Okay, so we have to apply and find compromises by an Indian aesthetic, by Indian idea of dharma, not by Western standards, because nobody will even understand what you're saying, just as the West cannot understand. They cannot fathom what we are saying many times. See, when we use the word yoga, we also mean luck. When we say yoga, we also mean a tendency. When we say yoga, as in karma yoga or bhakti yoga, we mean a path. When we say yoga, we also mean meditation and exercise. How much of this the world can get? This is called dhvani. The West can understand dhvani as sound. You have to be Indian to understand dhvani as resonance, as meaning, of contextuality. It brings memories as a meme, as a mnemonic. It's got so many ideas. This is what I'm saying. How can they understand us? We live in an oral tradition. Our great stories are told, not read.
Absolutely. Okay, so we have one more question by Anjan. How one Rama script, how can it dilute all the different narratives or that weave around the larger Ramayana tradition? And what is the thought process that is around it? Yeah.
See, A.K. Ramanujan famously said there are 200 Ramayanas. And you can see liberals around the world, quoting him, saying there are so many Ramayanas. There are so many Ramayanas because there is one Ramayana. There are so many interpretations because there's one narrative. Okay. You can change any number of things in it. Why are you not doing your own story? We're not asking for original. We're not caring. Actually, I'm telling you honestly, who cares? What is the original thing? Because that thing about, this is a quarrel of saying what came first, why is ancestry so important? It's a Max Muller set a date for when the Ramayana happened or when the Mahabharata happened. I don't think he really ventured to say when the Ramayana happened, but he ventures to speculate that the Mahabharata happened in one 1500 BC. How does he know? What is this? I mean, what is the proof? Right? And why is everybody quoting that, I'm saying, how do you know the Ramayana happened or the Mahabharata happened? Equally, how do you know it happened or it didn't happen? See, there is a very great thing that one of our liberal scholars said. He said, the Mahabharata, when it's interpreted, happens only there. All the Desi versions of the Mahabharata, all the left liberal versions where Shurpanaki is a heroine or a victim, or where Rama is a male chauvinist, and all that. I've seen all these things. I mean, this is the kind of experiment everybody is doing. We've seen all that. All that happens only then. The Ramayana that we are talking about is happening for 5,000 years. This is what I'm saying. The question is correct. Can anything dilute that? No. You don't need to be diluted. That is free of you. It does not matter how many people come and go. Can you imagine the number of centuries we've been conquered, we've been battered, we've been brutalized? Can you imagine the number of centuries we have suffered this? Yet the Ramayana lives, the Mahabharata lives. Why does it live? What other traditions in the world will take a 5,000-year-old text and offer it as your classical literature, even today? Is there a comparison? There is. Very few, but China has something. Koreans have something. The Japanese have something. Vietnam has something.
Yeah, so just last question that I have, and especially around what you just said. We heard Harisha ji's talking about Ramayana traditions in Southeast Asia. We talked about Ramayana theatre tradition here. How can dharmic conversation be weaved into creative productions now? And that can enhance the role of Indian soft power through theatre. Especially there's a lot of discussions that happen around creativity. There's a certain ideological bias that comes to it. There's a certain style that comes to it. So how do we stitch in the dharmic conversations around it?
The key element is this. If you see Ramayana as an acharana, as an observance, that means you do the Ramayana festival or you do Ramotsava, then it is actually, it is conflict free. It comes from surrender. You're inside the mythos that Rama is divinely endowed as a Maryada Purusha. He's not divinely endowed with powers to do miracles. He's divinely endowed to do the right thing, to do the dharmic duty. Okay? So you surrender to the Maryada Purusha there. Okay? That belongs to the idea of mythos. When you do logos, it means you're not part of the observance. That means the ritual ends with your taking up the role as I'm spectator and there is performer. That divide is there. When you go to a puja, everybody is doing the puja. Some person is physically conducting it. Some person is sitting, closing their eyes. Some people are just wearing good dresses and walking up and down. All their mood, feeling is they're observing the puja. That's a wedding too. Everybody in a wedding is observing the wedding. When I say observe, not looking, I'm saying that being the wedding. Okay, everybody. But in a play, you're not performing. In a formal play, there is a division between spectator and performer, which is not there in a ritual. Okay? In Indian traditional performance, the ritual sits in the middle. It is both ritual and performance. This is the miracle of it. It's an outstanding thing. A Yakshagana performance is both a yagna. By sitting there, you're getting the blessings of the deity. It is also a performance. And if you present conflict in that kind of meta space, where both come as role players, you meet mythos and logos in that point. It's an extraordinary thing. I'm beginning to lose interest in the formal theater that I have been doing for 40 years. Because I think this is such a strange state to be in, and beginning to get respect for sport, where if Virat Kohli is on 97 and he hits a ball, it goes to the boundary and somebody leaps up, prevents a sixer and catches the ball and he gets out, the pain you feel there, it's not real pain. It's, it is not even for Virat Kohli. He'll go now rest. He'll have lemonade maybe, or beer. I don't know what he drinks, but he'll be there. And nobody's paying, but you feel that I want that kind of aesthetic to be produced in the work we do on stage. I'm thinking now, it's a big challenge. I don't know how we can do it, but I'm beginning to admire this idea of traditional theater as a much better evolved aesthetic of performance than what I have learned from modern theatrical traditions.
We really wish that we see it sometime soon with you playing a major role in it. Before we end this session, I request Koti ji to play a short video clipping of the Ramakin, which is a Thai version of the Ramayana. And interestingly, it is a duet performance, which has a Thai artist as well as a Bharatnatyam dancer. So how do the two fuse in together? That's something good to see. Koti ji, can you please play the video?
Wow, what a great balance. Amazing, amazing. I don't think so you should stop clapping. Please continue clapping for amazing artists like these. Thank you. After Rama killed Ravana, Rama and Sita returned to Ayodhya. The people of Ayodhya celebrated their arrival by lighting thousands of lamps to welcome them as it was Amavasya, the new moon day. It is celebrated as Diwali in India. Lang Rama Kha Ravana Rama let Sita Krap Ma Ayodhya. ผู้คนจุดตะเกียงเป็นพันๆดวงนะคะ เพื่อฉลองการกลับมาของท่านนะคะ This led to a great celebration all over the world. Ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Koti ji. I think what we spoke about, there was a glimpse of Baliwad, there was a glimpse of the Tayu here. One thing that I noticed was there was a Lakshman Rekha episode was not here in my understanding of it. Yeah. So different versions, and with that we come to a close of this session and this day's journey with Ramayan, though the divine always stays with us. Thank you so much, Prakash ji. Thank you so much, Ambassador Harisha. And I'd take a special reference to ICCR, who've been collaborating with us, who've always been very supportive of this event. They've been having their presentations every now and then, so we really thank them. Any last words, Prakash ji, that you have to give?
No, I'm very admiring of Vijayalakshmi because she's struggled so hard. I've seen her for many years trying to change my mind. She was one of the reasons that I began to look inwards. Otherwise, and she has a wonderful team that she's now managed to build around her. All of you, I just admire you for your commitment and that you're able to do this, because I just want to say this last thing. India's soft power at the moment, it's not that it doesn't exist, it's just implicit. We have to make it explicit. And we start by saying to ourselves that we have some good in us, a lot of good in us. And just acknowledging that will make us better people, I think.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Namaste. Thank you.
Namaste. And thank you to all the participants who've stayed with us all this while. We hope to see you in that evening session. The session that begins at 5:30 is Handmade in India, where we look at Indian handicrafts, various forms of it, and how they have made a global presence now, followed by another session on performing arts. So we have Rukmani Vijay Kumar, she'd be chairing the session. We have Arushi Mudgal, an Odissi dancer. We have Surat Subramanian, who's taken Indian and global dance forms to different heights. So we hope to see you again. In the meanwhile, have a good evening and good afternoon. Namaste.